The moment Pearl Rhodes stepped off the stagecoach in Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1872, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and she had roughly 30 seconds to figure out which before the dust settled, and she had to face the man who had written her 47 letters over the course of 8 months. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a deep navy cotton that had seen better days after 3 weeks on the road from Cincinnati, and she pressed her lips together the way her mother had always told her not to because it made her look severe. Pearl was 22 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up in a practical bun and gray eyes that people often mistook for green depending on the light. She was not what most folks would call a delicate beauty. She was the kind of woman who looked like she could carry something heavy and probably had to, more than once, and the fact that she was standing in Abilene rather than behind the counter of her late father's mercantile in Cincinnati said everything about the kind of courage she carried quietly inside herself. The letters had started because of a notice her neighbor Mrs. Calloway had clipped from a gazette and pressed into Pearl's hands 3 days after her father's funeral. The mercantile had debts that Pearl had not known about, and the building had gone to the bank before the year was even out. With nothing left to hold her in Ohio except a small grave and memories that hurt to touch, Pearl had read that notice 4 times, then sat down and written a careful letter in her neatest hand to a man named Harvey Hawkins of Dickinson County, Kansas, who was seeking a wife to share a working cattle ranch and a life on the open prairie. She had not expected him to write back in 3 days. She had not expected his handwriting to be deliberate and unhurried, each word placed on the page like a man who meant what he said. She had not expected him to ask about her opinions on things, whether she preferred the smell of rain or fresh bread, what her mother had been like, whether she was afraid of thunderstorms or if she secretly liked them. Pearl had written back, and then again, and then 45 more times after that, and somewhere in those letters she had begun to understand that Harvey Hawkins was not a man who said things for the sake of saying them. In his 38th letter he had written something she had read so many times the paper had softened at the fold. He had written, "I cannot promise you everything, Pearl, because I am an honest man and honest men know they are not God, but I can promise you a peaceful life on this prairie. I can promise you a house that keeps the cold out and land that goes so far you will forget the world has edges. I can promise you that every word I write to you I mean in the plainest way a man can mean something. If you come out here, I will spend every day making sure you do not regret it." She had folded that letter back into its envelope and bought her stagecoach ticket the following morning. And now she was standing in the dust of Abilene, and the stagecoach driver was handing down her single trunk, and Pearl was scanning the street with her heart doing something inconvenient in her chest, looking for a man she had never seen, but felt she knew the shape of from the inside out. He was leaning against the post of the land office across the street, and she knew it was him before she could have explained how she knew. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that were not the consequence of show but of genuine labor, dressed in a plain work shirt the color of a faded sky and dark trousers tucked into boots that had been cleaned, but could not quite hide the honest wear on the leather. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pushed back slightly on his head, and beneath it was a face that was angular and weathered and serious in the way that prairie men often were, with dark eyes that were scanning the street just as Pearl was scanning it, looking for someone he recognized by the description of a letter and nothing more. Their eyes met, and Pearl felt something settle in her chest like a door finding its frame, quiet and right and almost startling in its simplicity. Harvey Hawkins straightened from the post and crossed the street with a stride that was unhurried but purposeful, and he stopped 2 feet in front of her and took his hat off, holding it in both hands, and said, "Miss Rhodes." His voice was lower than she had somehow imagined it, steady, like something built to last. "Mr. Hawkins," Pearl said, and she was proud of herself for keeping her own voice even, because her heart was not being at all helpful. He studied her for a moment without embarrassment or pretense, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand honestly, and then the serious line of his mouth softened into something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to make Pearl feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the Kansas sun. "You look exactly like I thought you would," he said. "That is meant as a compliment." "You look somewhat different than I imagined," Pearl said, and then she felt heat climb her cheeks because it had not come out quite the way she intended. "Good different or bad different?" he asked, and she caught the very edge of something like humor at the corner of his eyes. "Good different," she said, and she decided right then that she was going to stop being embarrassed and just be honest, because that was what 47 letters had built between them, and she was not about to let the actual presence of him ruin it. "You're taller. In my mind you were about 5'10". "I am sorry to disappoint," he said, and this time the smile arrived fully, and it was the kind of smile that transformed a man's whole face, sudden and genuine and a little bit shy around the edges, and Pearl thought that if she had seen that smile before she had ever written the first letter, she would have written it sooner. He helped her with the trunk himself, loading it onto the back of a wagon he had brought in from the ranch, and he offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat with the same natural courtesy that suggested it was simply the way he did things, and not a performance for her benefit. They set out northward from Abilene toward Dickinson County, and the land opened around them the way Pearl had never experienced land opening before, because in Ohio there were always trees and hills and things interrupting the sky, but out here the sky was the main event, and everything else was just the ground it stood on. For a while they rode in companionable silence, and Pearl was surprised to find that it was not uncomfortable. With most people she had met, silence required filling. With Harvey, it felt like another kind of conversation. "The ranch is about 12 miles north," he said eventually. "It is not large. 40 head of cattle this season, a horse herd of 8. My hand Tom Briggs helps me 3 days a week, but the rest of the time it is just me. It has been just me for about 4 years now." "Since your mother passed," Pearl said, because he had written about that in his 22nd letter. He glanced at her sideways, and she could see that it still mattered to him that she remembered. "Yes," he said. "She liked the prairie. She used to say it was the only place big enough to hold everything she felt." Pearl looked out at the grass moving in long, slow waves under the wind and understood exactly what his mother had meant. "I think I see what she was saying." "I hoped you would," Harvey said simply. The ranch was called Hawkins Creek, named for the thin run of clear water that cut through the eastern edge of the property. And when Pearl saw it for the first time in the late afternoon light, she felt something that surprised her, because she had been bracing herself to be politely positive about whatever she found, but what she found was genuinely lovely. The house was a one-story structure built of native limestone with good thick walls and a wide porch that caught the afternoon shade, surrounded by a kitchen garden that was in the early stages of spring planting. Beyond it, the land rolled gently westward in waves of grass, and far in the distance, a line of cottonwood trees marked the creek, their new spring leaves catching the light like scattered coins. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it so completely that her voice came out softer than she intended. Harvey had been watching her face rather than the landscape, and when she said it, he exhaled in a way that told her he had been holding that breath for some time. He showed her the house with the same quiet directness he brought to everything, explaining what he had done to prepare and what still needed doing, and Pearl noticed several things in rapid succession. He had put fresh curtains in the main bedroom, plain white cotton but neatly hung. He had put a vase of prairie wildflowers, purple and yellow, on the kitchen table. He had built a second bookshelf against the parlor wall, empty, presumably for whatever books she might bring, and the sight of that empty shelf hit Pearl somewhere unexpected, because it meant he had been imagining her there before she arrived, had been making room for her in the actual structure of the house, and that felt like the most intimate thing she had ever been shown. "The preacher in town is available on Saturdays," Harvey said. "There is no pressure for this week." "I thought you might want to settle first." He had thought of that too. Pearl looked at him standing in the doorway of the parlor, hat in his hands again, looking at her with that careful, steady gaze, and she thought that the 47 letters had done something remarkable. They had given her the inside of a man before she ever had the outside of him, and now that she had both, she understood that she was in very serious trouble of the heart, and that it had probably started somewhere around letter number 12, when he had written an entire paragraph about the way the winter wheat looked under moonlight, and had apologized at the end for waxing poetic, as he had put it, because he was a practical man, and he suspected poetry was not particularly useful. Pearl had written back that poetry was the most useful thing she knew of. "Next Saturday would suit me well," she said, and Harvey Hawkins nodded once, and that was settled. The week before the wedding was the strangest and most natural thing Pearl had ever experienced. They lived in the same house with the careful decorum that was expected and appropriate, Harvey rising before dawn to work the cattle and Pearl learning the geography of the kitchen and the garden and the surrounding land with systematic thoroughness. She walked the fence lines. She mapped the garden in her mind and began planning what she would plant. She baked bread and left a loaf on the table with a cloth over it, and when Harvey came in at midday and found it, he looked at it, and then at her with an expression of such unguarded pleasure that Pearl had to look away. In the evenings they sat on the porch after supper and talked. They talked the way they had written, directly, and without the social performances that Pearl had spent her whole life navigating in Cincinnati, where conversation was mostly about what you were not saying. Harvey said what he thought. When he was not sure of something, he said so. When he was tired, he said so and went to bed, but not before asking if Pearl needed anything, with the same practical consideration that he applied to the cattle. On the third evening, Pearl asked him why he had put the empty bookshelf in the parlor, and he looked at her from his chair and said, without any particular ceremony, "Because you mentioned in your 7th letter that your father had a shelf of books and you could still see them even after the bank took the building, just the shape of them in your mind. I figured a woman like you needed a place to put things that matter." Pearl sat very still for a moment. The prairie evening was pouring its colors over the western horizon, deep orange and pale rose, and a strip of gold that seemed to burn the longer you looked at it, and the wind had dropped to something barely a whisper, and the only sound was the distant cattle and the creak of the porch boards when Harvey shifted his weight. "I wrote that in my 7th letter," Pearl said. "I wrote over 40 letters and you remembered something from the 7th. "I remember everything you wrote," Harvey said, with no self-consciousness about it, the way he stated facts of the ranch or the weather. "I read them all more than once." Pearl looked at him in the fading light and thought that she had not expected to love him so quickly. She had expected a progression, a careful building of something over months and a year, the slow accumulation of a life shared. She had not expected to look at a man on a porch in Kansas 5 days after she stepped off a stagecoach and feel the full, clear, alarming weight of it already settled in her. She did not say it yet. She kept it carefully inside, the way you keep something fragile until you are sure the shelf can hold it. They were married on a Saturday morning in late April at the small Methodist church in the town of Salina, which was closer to the ranch than Abilene, and which Harvey had selected with characteristic practicality, noting in his planning that the road was better in spring. The ceremony was witnessed by Tom Briggs, Harvey's ranch hand, who was a quiet and deeply sunburned man of about 35 who shook Pearl's hand afterward with the grave solemnity of someone performing an important civic duty, and by a woman named Ida Mercer who ran the dry goods store in Salina, and who had apparently been friends with Harvey's mother, and had taken a proprietary interest in his welfare ever since. Ida Mercer was a small, round woman of about 60 with white hair and sharp brown eyes and an opinion about everything, delivered at a volume and speed that suggested she believed the world benefited from her thoughts, and the sooner it received them, the better. She embraced Pearl with a force disproportionate to her size and said, "Good, you look sensible. Harvey has been alone long enough, and a sensible woman is exactly what this situation requires. Can you cook?" "Yes," Pearl said. "Can you ride?" "I can learn." "Good enough," Ida said, with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. The wedding was simple and quiet, and exactly what Pearl wanted without ever having known what she wanted. Harvey said his vows looking directly at her with that steady dark gaze, his voice unhurried and clear. And when he said the words about loving and cherishing, Pearl had the absolute conviction that he was not reciting a formula but stating a plan, the way he stated everything, plainly and with full intention to follow through. When the preacher pronounced them married and Harvey took her hand, Pearl felt the warmth of it all the way through her, solid and sure as the limestone walls of their house. The first months of their marriage were a revelation to Pearl in a way she had not fully anticipated. She had expected to love the wide openness of the prairie, because the letters had painted it clearly, and she had felt the truth of it the first time she saw the land. She had expected to find the ranch work challenging and rewarding in roughly equal measure, because she was not a woman who shied from either difficulty or satisfaction. She had expected Harvey. What she had not expected was how the knowledge of him deepened so steadily, like the creek after a good rain, quiet and continuous and growing in ways you could only notice by looking at where it had been. She learned that he woke before the sun not from routine, but from some internal need to see the light come, that he stood on the porch in the first pale minutes of every morning with his coffee and watched the darkness dissolve like he was keeping a personal vigil for the day. She learned that he was extraordinarily patient with the cattle, that he knew each one by temperament and handled them accordingly, that there was not a mean or wasteful impulse in him when it came to the living things in his care. She learned that he read, that the shelf on his side of the parlor held a collection of books that ranged from practical cattle manuals to a battered volume of Keats that had been his mother's, and that he denied reading until one evening Pearl came in from the garden and found him with it open on his knee, and a look on his face like a man caught doing something he could not quite bring himself to be ashamed of. She did not tease him. She sat down and said, "Read me something." And after a moment's pause he read her a poem about nightingales and immortality, his voice quiet and even, and when he finished neither of them said anything for a while, and the prairie dark pressed softly at the window, and Pearl thought she had never felt so at home in any place or with any person as she felt in that moment. She had filled the empty bookshelf. She had brought 6 books in her trunk from Cincinnati, all that was left of her father's collection, and she added to them as the months went by, ordering from catalogs when Ida Mercer's store in Salina did not have what she wanted. Harvey never looked at her shelf with anything but an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though the filling of it was something he was watching complete itself. Summer on the prairie was a different creature entirely from the Kansas spring. The heat came down like something solid, and the grass turned from green to gold by July, and the work was relentless and physical in a way that Pearl discovered she did not mind. She had always been a woman who needed to be useful, and the ranch gave her an inexhaustible supply of usefulness. She tended the kitchen garden and put up preserves and learned to handle the milk cow, a placid brown animal of advanced years and impeccable manners, and she began to learn to ride, on a dun mare named Clover that Harvey chose for her with the same thoughtful care he brought to everything. Tom Briggs taught her the basics on the days he worked the ranch, with a methodical patience that Pearl appreciated, and by August she could ride well enough to go out with Harvey on the evening check of the cattle fence, which became one of her favorite things. The prairie in the evening was a different country from the prairie in the afternoon, softer and wider somehow, and they would ride the fence line while the sun went down ahead of them, and Harvey would sometimes talk about the land, about what it had been like before the cattle trails and the railroad, about his father who had homesteaded here and his mother who had loved it with the passion of a convert. And sometimes he would not talk at all, and they would just ride together in the long golden light with the grass moving around them. And Pearl would feel so full of something that she was not always sure there was a word for it in English. There was a trouble that summer, the kind of trouble the Prairie did not advertise in its beauty. A man named Cletus Ward ran a small operation about 8 miles south of the Hawkins ranch, and he was the kind of man who understood property lines primarily as things that inconvenienced him. He had been pushing his cattle north onto the edge of Hawkins grass for 2 seasons before Pearl arrived, and Harvey had tolerated it with increasing but contained tension, twice going to speak to Ward directly, and twice being met with the cheerful indifference of a man who had decided his neighbor's patience was a resource he could draw on indefinitely. Pearl saw the problem clearly after about 2 months, because she had made it her business to understand every aspect of the ranch's operations, and she could see in the survey map Harvey had filed with the county that Ward's cattle were grazing a strip of Hawkins land that was not incidental but consistent. "You have been polite about this for 2 years," Pearl said one evening, studying the map spread across the kitchen table. "I have," Harvey agreed, sitting across from her with his hands around his coffee cup. "Has that worked?" "Not even slightly." "Then we should go to the county land office and file a formal complaint with the documentation," Pearl said. "You have the survey. You have the dates of your conversations with Ward. A written record creates a legal record, and a legal record gives Ward something to reckon with that does not depend on his inclination to do right." Harvey looked at her across the table for a moment. "That is exactly right," he said. "I know," Pearl said, without smugness, because she was not a woman who needed to be told she was right in order to be useful. "I managed a mercantile for 2 years, Harvey. I know how to handle a man who takes advantage of good faith." They went to the land office in Salina the following week, and Pearl handled much of the paperwork while Harvey provided the details she could not know, and together they constructed a formal complaint that was delivered to Cletus Ward by the county marshal in early September. Ward pushed his cattle back south and stayed behind his property line for the remainder of the year, and if he harbored resentments about it, he kept them to himself, which was all Pearl had wanted. Harvey watched the whole process with a quality of attention that was different from how he usually watched things, a kind of focused appreciation that went beyond the practical, and on the way home from the land office he said, "My mother would have liked you enormously." It was the highest compliment he had ever given her, Pearl understood, and she felt it land in her heart and stay there. The autumn arrived the way the Prairie did everything, without apology and in full. The Kansas fall was a gold and copper burning across the grassland, the cottonwoods along the creek going bright as fire, the air sharpening to something clean and cold-edged that made Pearl feel awake in every part of herself. The cattle were fat and ready for market, and Harvey arranged the drive to Abilene with Tom Briggs and 2 extra hands he hired for the week. And on the morning they left, Pearl stood on the porch and watched the herd move south against the early light, Harvey on his big roan horse at the flank, and she felt the particular quiet that settles in when the person you love leaves a space in your day. He had said goodbye to her that morning before the sun was fully up, in the kitchen where she was making biscuits for the drive, and he had put his hand along the side of her face with a tenderness that still had the capacity to surprise her, because he was not a demonstrative man in public, and what he was in private was a gift she had not known to ask for. "I will be back by Thursday," he said. "I know you will," Pearl said. "Ida Mercer said she would check on you." "I am perfectly capable of 5 days alone on a ranch," Pearl said, and then because she could feel his concern and she loved it even when it was unnecessary, she added more gently, "But tell her Wednesday. We can have dinner." He had smiled at that sudden full smile that still made her heart do its undignified business, and he had kissed her forehead and gone out to his horse, and Pearl had stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride south until the herd took him into the golden distance. The 5 days were fine. Pearl was, as she had told him, perfectly capable. She managed the milk cow and Clover, and the 2 horses Harvey had left behind. She tended the garden through its autumn work. She patched a section of porch railing that had been troubling her for weeks. Ida came on Wednesday as arranged, and they had dinner and a thorough conversation about everything from the Prairie winter that was coming to the political situation in Topeka to the proper way to make apple butter. And Pearl enjoyed it enormously because Ida was sharp and direct and had no patience for decorative conversation. "You are happy," Ida said, with the air of someone confirming a calculation. "Very," Pearl said. "Good. I worried he would wait so long that the right woman would be taken." Ida said this without looking up from her apple butter. "He is a man who does not do things in halves. When he commits to something, it is for everything. The ranch, this land. I imagine it is the same with you." "It is," Pearl said quietly, thinking of 47 letters and a bookshelf built empty. Harvey came home Thursday evening as he had said he would, dusty and tired, and satisfied with the price the cattle had brought. And Pearl had supper waiting because she knew when he would arrive and had planned accordingly. And when he came through the door and saw the table set and smelled the food and saw Pearl standing at the stove, something crossed his face that was so unguarded and so complete that it was almost too private to witness. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her properly, which was not his usual method of greeting after a working trip, and Pearl put her arms around him and breathed in the horse and dust and cattle smell of him and felt the week's worth of quiet lift away. "Good trip?" she asked. "Good enough," he said. "Better to be home." The winter that came down on Dickinson County in late November of 1872 was serious business. Pearl had grown up with Ohio winters, but the Kansas prairie in winter was a different proposition, open and unobstructed, with winds that found their way through every gap in the world, and a silence on clear cold nights that was so absolute it had a sound of its own. Harvey banked the house against the cold with practiced efficiency, and Pearl learned the rhythms of winter ranching, the twice-daily checking of the cattle to make sure the water troughs had not frozen, the extra feed, the constant watching of the sky. She did not find it lonely. She found it, if anything, more intimate, the way cold weather closes a circle, pulling everything toward the fire and the warmth at the center of it. And the center of everything at Hawkins Creek was the kitchen in the evening, and the 2 of them reading or talking or sitting in the comfortable quiet that had become one of her greatest pleasures. Harvey taught her cribbage, and she taught him 3-card games she had learned from her father, and they were evenly matched in the way of 2 people who think in similar patterns, and their competitions were cheerfully contested and occasionally heated, and never serious because neither of them actually cared about winning. It was during one of those winter evenings in December, with snow coming down outside, and the fire going well and the cribbage board between them, that Pearl told Harvey she thought she was expecting. She said it matter-of-factly because that was how she did things, but she watched his face while she said it and saw it go through something complex and rapid, surprise first, then something she could only describe as awe, arriving on a face not given to theatrics, and it made her throat tighten. He put down his cards. He looked at her across the cribbage board for a moment with those dark eyes that had become as familiar to her as her own hands. "Pearl," he said, and just her name, just the one word, carried everything. "I think so," she said. "I will know better in another month." He reached across the board and took both her hands in his, and he held them with the same careful, strong grip he used for everything he considered precious, and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I feel perfectly fine," she said. "Stop looking at me as though I am made of glass." "I am not looking at you as though you are made of glass," Harvey said. "I am looking at you the way a man looks at something extraordinary." Pearl blinked. She was not a woman given to easy tears, and she had survived a father's death and a lost home and 3 weeks in a stagecoach without crying, but something about the plain simplicity of that statement, delivered in his steady voice across a cribbage board with snow outside the window, very nearly undid her. "You are going to make me cry, and I will be very annoyed at you for it," she said. Harvey's mouth curved into a smile that held something new and tender and wondering. "I can live with that," he said. The winter deepened, and Pearl was careful and sensible about her condition, and Harvey was careful and sensible about being attentive without being smothering, which she would not have tolerated, and which he understood without being told. He arranged for the county doctor in Salina to come out and examine her in January, a journey the doctor made with philosophical stoicism in the back of a wagon over frozen, rutted roads, and the doctor confirmed what Pearl had known and pronounced her in excellent health and entirely capable of her normal activities with appropriate moderation, which was exactly what she wanted to hear and what she had already decided was the case. Ida Mercer came out to the ranch when the weather allowed and appointed herself an auxiliary manager of the situation with characteristic forcefulness, bringing things Pearl had not asked for but often needed, and offering opinions on everything from which herbal tea was most beneficial to the comparative merits of various layettes. And Pearl bore it with a genuine affection, because she had come to love Ida the way you love something that is sometimes too much and always exactly enough. Tom Briggs, upon being informed by Harvey in a brief and factual statement over the fence one morning, responded with a silence of approximately 10 seconds and then said, "That is good news, Harvey." And that was the full extent of his contribution to the discussion, which suited everyone involved. The spring of 1873 came in warm and generous, and Pearl's garden was her great project and her great joy, expanded from the previous year because she had been planning it all winter over seed catalogs, and Harvey had broken additional ground for her in early March without being asked, because he had seen her studying the catalogs. The kitchen garden now included rows of vegetables that would carry them through another winter, and Pearl had added a section she called her pleasure garden, not for eating but for looking at, with seeds she had ordered from a catalog in St. Louis, zinnias and black-eyed Susans, and sweet William and larkspur in colors that would come up through summer like a conversation with the prairie about beauty. Their son was born in August of 1873 on a Thursday morning when the prairie was at its full golden summer height, and the air outside the bedroom window was full of the sound of grasshoppers and wind. Harvey was in the house, having refused to go further than the barn despite Pearl's suggestion that he find something useful to do somewhere he could not hear her, and the county doctor was present along with Ida, who had come the day before and installed herself in the kitchen with the authority of a general occupying a strategic position. Pearl worked hard and was not quiet about it, and when it was over and she was holding the small, astonishing, red-faced weight of her son, she felt a tiredness so thorough it was almost a kind of peace. Harvey came in. He looked at her first, a full, careful look that was asking all the questions he could not put into words, and Pearl gave him a small nod that told him she was well. And then he looked at the baby, and the expression that crossed his face was one Pearl knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the same instinctive, careful strength with which he held everything precious, and his hands were so large around the small bundle, and his face was so absolutely open in that moment, all the usual containment gone, just the pure, unguarded thing underneath. "Hello," Harvey said quietly to the baby, as though introducing himself to someone important. "James," Pearl said. "James Thomas Hawkins, for my father and for Tom." Harvey looked up at her. Tom Briggs was, by any accounting, not a demonstrative man, but when Harvey told him the baby's middle name the following day over the fence, Tom turned away and looked at the horizon for a long minute and then turned back and said, "That is a very fine name," in a voice slightly rougher than usual. James was a good baby in the sense that he was healthy and vigorous and unmistakably present in every room he occupied, which was not the same thing as easy but was better than the alternative. And Pearl and Harvey navigated the new landscape of parenthood with the same practical directness they brought to every other challenge, working out what the baby needed and how to provide it, and how to maintain the ranch operation simultaneously, and making it work because they made things work by default. The summer of 1873 rolled into autumn, and the patterns of the ranch continued: harvest and market and winter preparation. And Pearl moved through it all with James on her hip, or in the cradle Harvey had built in the winter, a piece of woodwork so solid and careful that Pearl had remarked it would outlast all of them, and Harvey had said that was the point. Something happened in September that Pearl would think about for a long time afterward. She had ridden out with James in a carrier Harvey had fashioned for exactly this purpose, to check on the kitchen garden's last harvest, and on the way back she had paused Clover on the small rise behind the house where you could see the full spread of the ranch, the house and barn, and the creek cottonwoods, and the grass going out in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky. And James had fallen asleep against her chest with the boneless total surrender of sleeping babies. And the late afternoon light was pouring gold across everything, and Pearl had sat there on her horse with her sleeping son and looked at the land that was hers and Harvey's, built from letters and promise and the daily accumulation of a life they were making together, and she had felt something so complete it was almost unbearable, like trying to hold the whole sky in your hands. Harvey found her there 10 minutes later, having come looking because supper was late, and he reined in beside her and looked at what she was looking at and did not say anything for a moment. "I love this," Pearl said, not entirely meaning the view. "I know," Harvey said. "I have always known you would." There was a difficulty in the winter of 1874 that shook the ranch more seriously than the Ward dispute had. A hard January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days and struck the cattle herd badly, as it struck ranches across the county. And by the time the storm cleared, Harvey had lost 11 head, which was not catastrophic but was significant, and the mood on the ranch was quiet and working through it in the way that Harvey faced hard things, directly and without drama, but not without feeling it. Pearl saw the weight of it on him clearly. She was good at reading Harvey, which was not something everyone could do because he did not advertise his interior life the way some men did. But she had learned to see it in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his silences. She did not try to talk him out of the weight or minimize the loss, because she understood instinctively that this was not what he needed. She made the practical contributions she could make, helping Tom assess the surviving cattle, keeping the accounts updated with the adjusted projections, researching the possibility of increasing the spring calving to compensate for the losses. What she also did, on the third evening after the storm when Harvey had come in late and sat at the kitchen table with the accounts book open and not looked at it for 10 minutes, was sit down next to him and put her hand over his on the table and not say anything at all. He turned his hand over and held hers. After a minute he said, "We will be all right." "I know we will," Pearl said. "I had thought to expand the herd this spring. That may have to wait a year." "It will keep," Pearl said. "The land is not going anywhere." He squeezed her hand. The kitchen was warm and James was asleep in the back room, and the wind outside was quiet now, the blizzard long gone and the stars brutal and clear above the frozen prairie. "I promised you a peaceful life on this prairie," Harvey said. "I did not say it would always be easy." "Peaceful is not the same as easy," Pearl said. "Peaceful means I am not afraid of what is coming. I am not afraid, Harvey, not of any of it, not with you." He looked at her for a long moment with those steady dark eyes, and then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it with a formality that was also entirely sincere. The way everything he did was sincere, and Pearl felt the word peaceful resound in her chest like a bell that had been struck once and was still ringing. The spring of 1874 was a recovery, the kind that the prairie itself modeled every year, returning from winter with insistent green life, and the cattle calving well, and the kitchen garden going in with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting all winter to be useful. Pearl planted her pleasure garden again and expanded it, because the pleasure it gave her was not a luxury she had any intention of surrendering, and Harvey had never once suggested it should be, which was one of the thousand small reasons she loved him in the steady and absolute way she did. Ida Mercer came out in April with news. She came with the speed and directness of a woman who understood that news deteriorated if not delivered promptly, and she settled herself at the kitchen table with Pearl and James, who was now 8 months old and conducting independent research on the texture of the tablecloth, and said that the railroad was planning an extension that would bring the line closer to the western part of Dickinson County, and that the land along the proposed route was already being bought up, and that if Harvey was interested in selling any of the eastern acreage that was furthest from the creek and the home pasture, now was the time to speak to the land agent before the speculators got there first. Pearl listened to all of this with the full attention she gave to anything that affected the ranch, and then she said she would discuss it with Harvey, and Ida said that she thought Pearl already knew what she thought about it, and Pearl said that knowing what she thought and acting without Harvey's knowledge were different things, and Ida said that was exactly right, and that was why Pearl was good for him, and Pearl told her to have another piece of pie. The conversation with Harvey that evening was one of the most interesting they had ever had, because they disagreed. Not badly or with heat, but genuinely and substantively, the way two people who both think clearly and independently will sometimes land on opposite sides of the same question. Harvey was reluctant to sell any portion of the land, which Pearl understood entirely, because the land was not just an asset to him. It was the thing his father had built and his mother had loved, and it was what he was making into something for James and whoever else might come along, and every acre of it was not incidental. Pearl's position was more pragmatic. The eastern section was not the best pasture. It was not the most useful land they held. Selling it at a railroad premium would fund the herd expansion that the January blizzard had postponed and leave them in a stronger position across the board. They sat with the map between them and talked about it the way they talked about everything, directly and without performance, and Harvey asked questions that Pearl answered and Pearl asked questions that Harvey answered, and somewhere in the third hour of it, Harvey looked at the map and then at Pearl and said, "You are right about the eastern section." "I know," Pearl said, and then, because she loved him and because it was true, "but it still costs something to sell it. I know that." "It does," Harvey said. "But the ranch is for James, for our family, not for sentiment about parcels." They sold the eastern section in May at a price that made even Ida's sharp eyes widen approvingly, and the funds went into the herd expansion and into improvements to the barn, and into a new well on the western pasture that Harvey had been wanting for 2 years. By the summer of 1874, the Hawkins Creek Ranch was in better shape than it had ever been, and Pearl felt the satisfaction of that the way she felt everything good about their life, quietly and with her whole self. James learned to walk in October, with the catastrophic enthusiasm of a person who has discovered something wonderful and has absolutely no interest in caution. Pearl watched him career across the kitchen floor and into the legs of the table and back up and off again, and felt such a flood of love and laughter that she had to sit down. Harvey watched from the doorway with the particular expression he wore when James did things, a helpless delight that he was not quite able to contain within his usual composure, and Pearl loved him for it, for the way James had opened something in him, some room he had not known was there. "He is going to be exactly like you," Pearl said. "God help him," Harvey said. "That is not a thing to complain about," Pearl said. "Trust me." Harvey looked at her across the kitchen, across their son, who was now investigating the base of the wood stove with the scientific intensity of a very small person, and the look on his face was the one Pearl loved best, the one that was entirely for her, quiet and deep and completely certain. "I know it," he said. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was gentler than the one before, cold enough to be proper but without the brutality of the January blizzard, and the ranch came through it well with the herd expanded, and the new well providing good water access on the western pasture. Pearl was expecting again by Christmas, and this time she told Harvey not across a cribbage board but on the porch, because the evening was mild enough for December and the stars were extraordinary over the prairie, and it seemed like the right kind of place for the news, which it was. Harvey stood very still for a moment in the way he had of receiving important information, processing it fully before responding, and then he turned to her and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," Pearl said. He put his arm around her and they stood together looking at the winter stars above the prairie, James asleep inside, the ranch breathing quietly around them, and Harvey said, "I am the luckiest man in this county." "In this state," Pearl said. "In this country," Harvey said and pulled her closer. Their daughter was born in July of 1875 on a morning of considerable drama and ultimately complete success, and she was named Catherine after Harvey's mother, which Pearl had decided privately months before, and which Harvey received with a kind of speechless gratitude when she told him. Catherine was, from her first hours, a person of very clear opinions about her preferences, which she expressed without the slightest hesitation, and Harvey looked at his daughter with the same awe he had looked at his son, and said with complete sincerity that she was going to be trouble. "The best kind," Pearl said from the pillow, exhausted and incandescent. "Exactly like her mother," Harvey said, and it was not a complaint. James, at almost 2 years old, regarded his sister with the caution of someone who has been told something large is coming, and is not entirely sure how to feel about it having arrived. He stood at the side of the bed and looked at Catherine with his father's serious dark eyes and eventually reached out one careful finger and touched her hand, and Catherine, who had been squalling with great enthusiasm, went suddenly quiet and looked at her brother with the unfocused concentration of the very newly born. "Well," Harvey said, from beside Pearl's bed, watching his children. "Well indeed," Pearl said. There is a particular quality to a life well lived in its middle passages, not the drama of beginning or the nostalgia of looking back, but the daily and miraculous ordinary of it, and the years between 1875 and 1878 at Hawkins Creek were exactly that for Pearl and Harvey, the full-lived ordinary of two people building a life together with intention and love, and the practical cooperation of two people who respect each other wholly. The ranch grew. Harvey added to the herd steadily and wisely, not overextending but not undershooting the available land either, and Pearl kept the accounts with the precision of someone who had grown up balancing a mercantile ledger, and who found that numbers told you the truth if you asked them the right questions. Tom Briggs became a permanent fixture rather than a 3-day hand, building a small house on the southeast corner of the property with Harvey's help, and becoming as much a part of the landscape of Hawkins Creek as the creek itself. Pearl's garden expanded again in 1876, the pleasure garden now a proper strip of color along the south side of the house that she tended with the same combination of practicality and genuine delight that she brought to everything good in her life. Ida Mercer declared it the finest garden in Dickinson County, and then argued with Pearl about whether Sweet William or Larkspur provided better color in July, and they had the same argument every summer and both of them enjoyed it enormously. James grew up on the ranch with the easy competence of a child who has been shown the value of work from the time he could walk, riding before he was 4 and helping with the cattle by 6 in the small ways that mattered, handing things and watching and asking questions that Harvey answered with complete patience. Catherine was, as Harvey had predicted, a person of strong and cheerfully stated views, who conducted her life at the ranch with an authority that bore no relationship to her small size, and who had Harvey entirely managed by the time she was 3 years old, a fact he was aware of and had apparently made his peace with. Pearl watched Harvey with his children and felt the same thing every time, the quiet, enormous fullness of it, that this was her life and she had chosen it with both eyes open, and it was beyond what she had thought to ask for. There was something Pearl had been thinking about through 1877, turning it over with the care she gave to things that mattered, and it was about the land west of the creek. Harvey owned it, but it was not being used effectively. It was grazing land of decent quality, but without the infrastructure to manage it well. And Pearl had been doing research, reading what she could find about the land development and the homestead provisions, and talking carefully with Ida, who had connections in Salina and Topeka that Pearl had learned to use judiciously. She brought it to Harvey on an October evening with the accounts book and a pencil and her full attention, laying out what she had been thinking with the directness that was her way. And Harvey listened with his elbows on the table and his eyes on her face, the way he listened to things that mattered. Her proposal was this. The western land could support a proper sheep operation in addition to the cattle, not large, not in competition with the cattle side of things, but a supplementary operation that would provide wool income in the spring and mutton income in the autumn, and would use the western grass that was currently underutilized. She had looked at the numbers from two similar operations she had read about in a Kansas agricultural bulletin, and she had looked at their own costs and projections, and the conclusion was clear. Harvey was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he said, "Sheep." "Sheep," Pearl confirmed. "I have never run sheep." "Neither had you run a ranch before your father showed you," Pearl said. "We can learn." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had come to know as the one he wore when he was genuinely thinking and not just considering, and then he said, "You have already figured out where to start, haven't you?" It was not quite a question. "I have identified a rancher in the next county who is reducing his operation and would sell a starting flock at a reasonable price," Pearl said. "Yes." "Of course you have," Harvey said, and the smile arrived, the full one, the one that transformed his face, and Pearl sat across the table from him in the lamplight and loved him so thoroughly she could barely stand the weight of it, and was not even slightly inclined to put it down. The sheep arrived at Hawkins Creek in the spring of 1878, 20 ewes and 2 rams purchased from the rancher Pearl had located, and they transformed the western pasture into something noisier and more complicated and considerably more profitable within the first year. Tom Briggs was skeptical and then pragmatic and then genuinely interested as the operation proved its worth, and Harvey managed the learning curve with the same patient competence he brought to all living things on the property, and Pearl kept the accounts and watched the numbers improve and felt the satisfaction of a good idea well executed. James was 5 years old in the spring of 1878, and Catherine was nearly 3, and the ranch was the world they were growing up in, wide and physical and full of things to learn, and Pearl taught them with the same combination of structure and genuine curiosity that she believed education required. She had ordered books for James from a St. Louis catalog and taught him his letters at the kitchen table, and Harvey had started taking him out on the early morning cattle checks, because the boy needed to know the land he would inherit the way you know something in your bones. On a May morning in 1878 that was as fine as any morning Pearl could remember, she was in the pleasure garden cutting the first larkspur of the season, James at her elbow asking questions about bees with the relentless and earnest thoroughness of a 5-year-old who has decided to understand something completely, and Catherine sitting in the garden path with a stick and a pile of dirt, conducting operations that required full concentration. Harvey came around the corner of the house from the barn, having finished the morning work, and stopped when he saw all 3 of them there in the garden in the morning light. Pearl looked up and found him looking at them with an expression so unguarded and so complete that it stopped the breath in her. He was standing in the early sun in his work clothes with the ranch morning behind him and the whole wide Kansas sky over him, and on his face was everything, all of it, the life they had built and the children in it, and whatever he felt about Pearl that he had said 47 times in letters and 1,000 times since in ways both spoken and otherwise, all of it present on his face in one moment, undone by a garden on a May morning. Pearl straightened up with her larkspur in her hand and looked at him and felt exactly what he was looking at, felt it from the inside, the impossible fullness of a life that was exactly what it had been promised to be. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," Harvey said, and his voice had the quality it had when he was feeling something he was not going to try to reduce to practicalities. James had already launched himself at his father with the velocity of a small person who has no reason to manage his own enthusiasm, and Harvey caught him with one arm and swung him up with the easy strength of a man who had been doing the work of a ranch for 20 years, and Catherine looked up from her dirt operations and said, "Papa," with the authority of someone confirming a fact. Harvey looked at Pearl over James's head and said, "I need to tell you something." Pearl raised her eyebrows. "That sounds serious." "It is not serious," Harvey said. "It is the opposite of serious. I was riding the north fence this morning and the prairie was doing that thing it does in May, where the grass is still young enough to be green but the sun is high enough to make it gold, and I was thinking about the first time you saw it from the wagon. You said it was beautiful." "I remember," Pearl said. "I have been thinking about that every May since," Harvey said. "Every year the grass does that, and I think about your face when you saw it the first time." Pearl stood in her garden with larkspur in her hands and her children around her and her husband looking at her across the morning, and she thought about a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Abilene with a single trunk and 47 letters and more courage than certainty, and she thought about an empty bookshelf and a promise written in a careful hand, a peaceful life on the prairie, meant in the plainest way a man can mean something. "Harvey," she said. He said, "I love you more than I know how to say." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that she had come to know the way she knew her own hands. "I know you do," he said. "I feel the same way." It was not poetry in the conventional sense, but it was exactly right. The way everything he said was exactly right, plain and certain and meaning everything it said. The summer of 1878 moved through the prairie in its long golden way, and the ranch was fully humming, cattle and sheep and garden and children, and the daily work of a life built with care. And Pearl felt at home in it with every part of herself. Not the home of a place you were born into, but the home you chose and built, and the kind that fits better because of it. There was a day in late August that Pearl would remember always as the day the prairie showed itself off completely. One of those perfect Kansas days that arrives without warning, clear and warm without the summer's brutal heat. The sky so intensely blue it seemed to have depth you could fall into. The grass golden and moving in a steady southwest wind. The whole world smelling of warm earth and grass, and the faint sweetness of whatever was blooming in the distant prairie. Harvey saddled Clover for Pearl in the morning without being asked, which was his way of saying he had noticed the weather and thought she should be on a horse in it. He saddled his own roan and they rode out together, leaving James with Tom Briggs, who had become an auxiliary uncle of considerable patience, and Catherine in her portable crib on the porch where Ida Mercer, who had come for the week, could see her. They rode west, out past the sheep pasture and through the gap in the western fence and into the open prairie that stretched uninterrupted for miles, the land that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after, ancient and massive and completely indifferent to everything except the living out of its own nature, which was exactly what made it magnificent. They rode without speaking for a long time, side by side on the horses that knew each other as well as their riders did, and the wind came and the grass moved around them in long shining waves, and the sun was high and clean and the world was enormous. Harvey reined in on a low rise and Pearl stopped beside him and they looked out at it together. "This is what I promised you," Harvey said. "When I wrote that letter, this is what I meant." Pearl looked at the prairie spread out before her, boundless and honest and entirely itself. And then she looked at Harvey, at the man who had written her 47 letters and met her in the dust of Abilene and built her a bookshelf and promised her a peaceful life and meant every single word. And she thought that a promise kept was one of the rarest and most extraordinary things in the world, and she had been the recipient of one. and the weight of that gratitude was something she carried like a gift she had not deserved and would spend the rest of her life being worthy of. "You kept it," she said. "Every word of it." "I meant every word of it," Harvey said simply. They sat on their horses on the rise and looked at the prairie in the August light, and Pearl felt the whole of it, the years behind them and the years ahead. James, who would grow up on this land, and Catherine, who would grow up on this land, and whatever else the years might bring. The hard winters and the good springs and the blizzards and the lambing seasons and the evenings on the porch and the mornings with coffee and the long golden rides on days like this one. All of it. The whole full, ordinary, extraordinary life of it. "Harvey," she said. "Pearl," he said and smiled because he recognized the tone. "I think there might be another baby coming." He turned to look at her fully, and the expression on his face was the same one it had been the first time. Astonishment moving into awe and then into that deep particular joy that made him look entirely open. And Pearl loved him helplessly and completely and with every available piece of herself. "Are you sure?" he said. "Not entirely, but I have been here before and I recognize the neighborhood." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, his large, rough, capable hand around hers, and held it in the sunlight on the high Kansas prairie with the wind moving through the grass around them. "Good," he said, with enormous simplicity. "Good," Pearl agreed. The autumn of 1878 confirmed what Pearl had suspected, and the news was received by their small world with enthusiasm proportional to each person's character. Ida Mercer declared it excellent and immediately began reorganizing the expected timeline of her own calendar to accommodate. Tom Briggs said it was good news in his reliable way. James, when told he was going to have another brother or sister, looked at his father with deep suspicion and said, "Will it be like Catherine?" Harvey told him with complete seriousness that no two were alike, which James appeared to find only partially reassuring. Catherine herself was too young for the news to be meaningful, but she was currently very interested in the wool from the sheep, which she called Cloud, and was conducting ongoing diplomatic negotiations with Tom Briggs to be allowed to pet the rams, negotiations that Tom was losing with the inexorable slowness of someone who does not realize they are losing until the thing is done. Pearl managed the autumn with the same capable pace she managed everything, adjusting where adjustment was needed and not adjusting where it was not. And Harvey was everything he had always been, present and practical and tender in the ways that were his. And Pearl went to bed every night with the weight of the day settled on her, and the sound of the prairie at the window and the warmth of her husband beside her, and felt the deep, comprehensive peace of a life she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. Their second son was born in the spring of 1879, April, when the prairie was green and the meadowlarks were back, and the world was beginning again in its annual generous way. He was named Samuel, which had been Pearl's father's first name, and which she had been keeping in reserve. Samuel arrived with considerably less drama than Catherine had and considerably more than James, which seemed to suit him as a middle position in the family, and he had from his first days an equanimity that Pearl recognized as Harvey's particular quality of stillness, wearing an infant's face. Harvey held his second son in the early morning light of the bedroom with the April prairie outside the window, and the whole house quiet and James and Catherine asleep and Pearl watching from the pillow, and he looked at the baby with the same astonished gratitude he had looked at both of his children, the expression that undid all his composure and left just the man underneath. "3," Pearl said. "3," Harvey agreed, without looking up from Samuel. "Are you keeping count?" He looked up at her then, and the smile arrived, the full one, and it was exactly the same smile it had been the first time she saw it in the dust of Abilene, sudden and genuine and slightly shy around the edges, and Pearl's heart did the thing it had always done in response to it. "I am the luckiest man in this country," Harvey said. "You said that before. It keeps being true." The years gathered themselves into the fabric of Hawkins Creek, with the texture of good work and good love, and the ordinary miracle of a family becoming itself. James grew into a serious and capable boy who had his father's patience and his mother's precision. And by the time he was 8, he knew the ranch well enough to point out things Tom Briggs had missed, which Tom bore with good grace and some private pride. Catherine remained exactly who she had always been, a person of strong convictions and enormous warmth, and a gift for getting what she wanted from everyone around her while making them feel good about providing it, which Pearl recognized as a particular kind of intelligence and encouraged accordingly. Samuel was a sunny and amiable child who moved through the world with the untroubled ease of someone who has never found a reason to be otherwise, and who demonstrated by age 3 that he had inherited Pearl's love of plants by spending an entire afternoon in the kitchen garden, informing the beans of his opinions. Pearl stood on the porch of their house in the summer of 1881 and looked at what she had come to Abilene with a single trunk and 47 letters to find. And what she found was so much more than she had known to look for that she sometimes felt the wonder of it like a physical thing. The ranch was thriving. The cattle herd was the largest it had ever been, carefully managed and productively run, and the sheep operation had more than proved Pearl's projections, providing a reliable secondary income that had made the difference in 2 years where the cattle market was difficult. The house had been expanded in 1879, an addition on the north side that gave them a proper parlor separate from the kitchen and a room for each of the children, and Harvey had built every stick of it with Tom Briggs's help and the careful intention of a man who builds for permanence. Pearl's bookshelf, the one that had been built empty and waiting for her, was full. It had always been full, expanding in her mind each time she ordered another book, and she had begun to run over onto a third shelf that Harvey had added without commentary in 1880, simply putting it up one Saturday while Pearl was in the garden and saying nothing about it because it did not require saying. Ida Mercer came every month without fail, because Ida had appointed herself a permanent fixture of the Hawkins Creek household, and no one had found an argument sufficient to suggest she shouldn't, and the children regarded her with the comfortable familiarity of a landscape feature that speaks and has opinions. She and Pearl had been arguing about the garden for 9 years and showed no signs of resolving any of it, which was precisely the point. Tom Briggs had built a proper home for himself on the ranch now, a decent-sized house with a kitchen garden of his own and a barn for his 2 horses, and he had in 1880 married a quiet and sensible woman from Salina named Harriet, who had the same bone-deep competence as Tom and who had folded herself into the Hawkins Creek community with the undemonstrative ease of someone who has found their place and intends to stay in it. The community itself had grown around them. Dickinson County was no longer the raw frontier edge it had been in 1872, and while it was still Kansas Prairie, emphatically and completely, there was more of a town to Salina now, more established and more connected. The railroad extension had come through as Ida had predicted, and with it came people and commerce and a general acceleration of things. Pearl found the changes interesting and was selective about which ones she imported into the rhythm of the ranch, keeping what was useful and setting aside what was merely new. There were harder things in those years too, because there always were, and Pearl would not have looked away from them even if she could. The drought year of 1880 was difficult for everyone in the county, and Harvey managed it with the careful husbandry of a man who understands that you cannot argue with the weather, only plan for it. 2 calves were lost in a difficult spring the same year, and Pearl saw how it sat on Harvey, the way it always did when something in his care was lost, not crushing but present, and she did what she had always done, which was to be beside him without requiring him to be different than he was. The question of the prairie itself was something Pearl thought about more as the years went by, because the world around the frontier was changing with a speed that sometimes felt unsettling. The great buffalo herds that had once defined this landscape were nearly gone by the early 1880s, replaced by cattle, and the peoples who had called this land home for generations before any Homestead Act had been handed terms by the government in ways that Pearl, who had a clear and uncompromising sense of right and wrong, recognized as deeply unjust, whatever the political arguments of the time said otherwise. She talked about this with Harvey in the evenings, and Harvey had no comfortable answer to offer her because the truth had no comfortable answer, only the acknowledgement of it and the attempt to live with decency in one's own sphere and to teach the children to see the world honestly. They did what they could with what was in their hands, which was the best and sometimes the hardest way to live. James came to his mother in the autumn of 1881 with a question she had been expecting for some time, because he was 9 years old and of his father's character, and his father's character required understanding things, and the question was about the land before the ranch, about who had been there before the Hawkinses came. Pearl sat with him in the parlor and told him what she knew honestly and without softening it beyond recognition, because he was her son and she had not raised him to prefer comfortable untruths. And Harvey came in partway through and sat down and added what he knew. And the conversation that resulted was one of the things Pearl would remember as a mark of who they were and who they were trying to make their children. James sat with it for a long time after in the way he sat with things, and then he said, "What do we do about it?" "You live honestly," Harvey said. "You treat every person with the fairness you would want. You do not pretend things are what they are not." James thought about this. "That seems like not enough," he said. "It is not enough," Pearl said, "but it is what is in your hands. You do not abandon what you can do because you cannot do everything." James was quiet a while longer, and then he nodded, with the gravity of a child processing a large thing. And Pearl looked at her son in the lamplight and thought that he was going to be a good man, was already on his way to being one, and the feeling that moved through her was the particular pride of a mother who sees not her reflection but something better and independently itself. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was mild, and the spring came early and generous, and Pearl stood in her garden on a morning in April and found herself taking stock in the way she sometimes did, the internal account book, the tallying of things that mattered. 3 children and a working ranch and a home that had become itself over 9 years of living in it, and a man who had promised her a peaceful life on the prairie and had meant every word he said and had kept every word he had meant. Harvey came to the garden looking for her with his coffee in hand and James beside him, the boy having been out on the early cattle check and walking with the easy rolling stride that was his father's. And Pearl looked at the two of them coming through the spring morning with the whole prairie behind them, and felt the gratitude of it settle in her so completely and permanently that she thought it might be the closest thing to prayer she knew how to manage. Harvey stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was nothing specific and everything, the garden and the house and the land going out under the big sky. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Pearl considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I am thinking that it has been 9 years since I stepped off the stagecoach in Abilene," she said. 9 years last week," Harvey confirmed. "You kept count?" "I always keep count," he said, with the simplicity of a man who finds this unremarkable. Pearl looked at him, this man she had found in 47 letters, this man of steady hands and kept promises and a shelf built empty in a room it had taken her weeks to get used to calling hers and months longer to call home, and now could not imagine any other word for. "You promised me a peaceful life," she said. "I did," Harvey said. "It has been exactly that," Pearl said. "Peaceful is not always easy and it is not always simple, but I have never been afraid of what is coming. I have never felt that the ground was unreliable under my feet. That is what you gave me. That is what you meant when you wrote it." Harvey was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the April morning light. James had found something interesting near the fence post and was investigating it. The ranch was moving around them in its familiar rhythms, the sounds of cattle and the distant creek and the wind in the grass. "You are what you gave me," Harvey said. "All of it. The ranch is better for you. I am better for you. Every good thing I can point to in the last 9 years has you in it somewhere." Pearl felt the familiar fullness rise in her chest, the one that had no adequate name, only the feeling itself. "Harvey Hawkins," she said, "you are going to make me cry again." "You can be annoyed at me about it," he said, with a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "I will be," she said, and was not. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they stood in the April garden and watched James discover whatever the fence post was hiding. And the prairie morning poured its light over all of it, over the house and the garden and the children and the land that went all the way to the horizon and a little past. The years of the early 1880s at Hawkins Creek were the fullest years Pearl could name. Samuel found his great passion early, which was horses, a passion Harvey encouraged with the enthusiasm of a man who had always felt that an intelligent child finding a right thing deserved support without complication. By age 5, Samuel could be found in the barn at any hour, communing with the horses in his easy way, and Harvey had given him a horse of his own, a small bay gelding of gentle temperament, with the same deliberateness with which he gave all his children the things he saw they needed. Catherine at 7 was already a woman of pronounced organizational abilities, which she exercised primarily upon her brothers and secondarily upon the adults in her life. And Pearl watched this with a careful attention that was deciding how much of it to encourage and in what directions. She encouraged it deliberately, giving Catherine real responsibilities around the house and the garden, and letting her manage them her own way, because a capable person denied the exercise of their capabilities becomes frustrated, and Pearl had been a capable person in circumstances that denied her that exercise, and she knew what it cost. Harvey watched Pearl with Catherine the way he watched Pearl with all the children, with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that he was watching something being done well, and that the watching itself was a form of learning. They had never divided the children along lines of who did what with them, because neither of them thought that way about it. Harvey taught James and Catherine and Samuel the ranch. Pearl taught them to read and think and keep accounts. They both taught them everything else in the daily and unceremonious way that most real education happens, through living alongside people who live with intention. In the summer of 1882, a family came through on the road north, the Abernethy family, a husband and wife and 4 children who had been traveling for 6 weeks from Missouri looking for land, and had run into a run of bad luck that had left them with a broken wagon wheel and insufficient supplies, and a wife who was clearly in the late stages of an exhausting pregnancy. Harvey found them on the North Road in the afternoon and brought them back to the ranch without asking anyone's permission or advice, because it was not a complicated decision from where he stood. Pearl had food on the table within an hour. She gave the Abernethy children bread and milk and sat with the mother, whose name was Ruth, and assessed the situation with calm practicality and arranged for the county doctor to come from Salina, which Harvey rode for immediately. Ruth Abernethy's baby arrived 2 days later at the Hawkins Creek house, a healthy girl, and the Abernethys stayed for 10 days while Albert Abernethy's wagon was repaired and the family recovered. In those 10 days, Pearl learned from Ruth Abernethy something she had not known precisely but had felt, which was the weight of traveling toward something uncertain with everything you had, the specific courage of people heading into a new life with nothing but intention to hold them. She recognized it because it was something she had done herself 10 years ago, in a navy cotton dress, stepping off a stagecoach in Abilene into the dust and the unknown. She told Harvey this on the evening before the Abernethys left. They were on the porch, which was where they returned to every evening as the center of their life, and the summer dark was settling over the prairie with the slow luxury of long days, and the fireflies were beginning at the edge of the garden. "I was frightened," Pearl said. "When I arrived in Abilene, I did not let it show and I did not let it stop me, but I was frightened. I know, Harvey said. Pearl looked at him. You knew. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met, he said. You had written me 47 letters, and you knew me exactly as well as letters can make you know a person and not 1 inch further, and you stepped off that stagecoach in a town you had never seen to marry a man you had never met. That is extraordinary. It was not extraordinary, Pearl said. It was terrifying and also exactly the right thing, and those are not contradictions. No, Harvey said. They are not. They sat with the summer evening around them and the fireflies at the garden edge and the children asleep inside, and Pearl thought about the word that had started everything, the word peace, that Harvey had written into a letter 47 letters before she arrived in Abilene. I was not peaceful when I arrived, she said. I am peaceful now. That is what you gave me. We gave each other, Harvey said. You gave it to me first, Pearl said. You promised it and then you kept it. That is not nothing, Harvey. That is everything. He turned his head and looked at her in the summer dark. This woman who had come to him from Cincinnati with a trunk and more courage than most people knew they were capable of, and who had become the whole interior landscape of his life, had become the thing he oriented by the way you orient by a fixed star. And he reached over and took her hand the way he had done 10 years ago over a cribbage board, and kept on doing in every ordinary moment that turned out not to be ordinary at all. I meant it, he said, every word. I know you did, Pearl said. I have always known you did. The Abernethys went north the next morning and eventually found their land, which Pearl heard about through a letter Ruth sent the following spring, full of the cautious joy of people who have arrived at the place they were heading toward and found it real. Pearl wrote back and felt the connection of it. Two women who had traveled toward something uncertain and found it true, the rarest and best possible outcome. The summer turned and the autumn came in its golden way, and James was 12, and Catherine was 10, and Samuel was 6, and the ranch was as fine as Pearl had ever known it. And on an October morning she stood in the kitchen making bread, which she had made in this kitchen 1,000 times, and which still gave her the same quiet pleasure it always had. And Harvey came in from the morning work and poured himself coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and watched her work with the expression he wore when he was full of something and not quite saying it. Pearl shaped the dough without looking at him. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing bad," he said. "I know it is not bad," she said. "I can tell the difference. What is it?" He was quiet a moment longer, and then he said, "I was riding the south fence this morning and I went past the rise, you know, the one where you can see the whole property from one side to the other." "I know it," Pearl said. She had stopped on that rise on Clover 100 times. "I stopped there and I looked at it," Harvey said, "the whole of it, and I thought about the morning you arrived, what this place looked like when you first saw it." Pearl put the bread in its pans and covered them and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her husband at her kitchen table with his coffee in his hands. "And," she said. "And I thought that I am not sure I can say what I want to say," Harvey said. He was looking at his coffee, which is not usually my problem. Pearl was quiet because she had learned long ago that Harvey Hawkins, when he was working toward something that mattered, needed room to get there. He looked up at her. "I thought about what I wrote you, about a peaceful life. And I thought that I was very sure when I wrote it that I knew what I meant, but I understand now that I only knew part of it. I knew I meant the land and the quiet and the house built solid. But I did not know that I would also mean you, standing in a kitchen or a garden or on a horse or in any room of any place, because you are what peaceful means to me. You have become the meaning of the word." Pearl stood against the counter in her kitchen with the bread dough resting under its cloth, and the October morning outside the window, and her husband looking at her from the table with the full, open honesty of his face entirely available to her. No composure, just the man, just the thing he had been carrying since the south fence ride and needed her to have. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him and put both her hands on the table, and he put his over them. And she looked at him for a long moment with everything she felt completely legible in her face, which she did not bother to manage because he deserved to see it. "Harvey," she said. He said, "I have known that for years," she said. "I have felt exactly that, and I have tried to find words for it, and the closest I have ever gotten is that you are the ground under my feet. You have always been the ground under my feet, and that is the most peaceful thing in the world." The kitchen was warm and the bread was rising, and the prairie was doing what it always did outside the window, being vast and honest and completely itself. And inside the kitchen was the center of the world for Pearl and Harvey Hawkins, two people who had found each other in the particular and improbable way that people sometimes do, across distance and through paper, and by the grace of a letter written in a careful hand, and kept across every season that followed. The years went on, and the years were good. James took to the ranch the way the land took to rain, naturally and thoroughly. And by the time he was 15, he was riding and working alongside Harvey with the ease of someone who is doing the thing he was made for. And Harvey taught him with the same patient thoroughness with which he had been taught by his own father, passing the knowledge of the land from hand to hand across the generations in the way that only this kind of life allows. Catherine grew into herself with an energy and clarity of purpose that Pearl recognized and was proud of. A young woman who knew her own mind and was not afraid to say so, and who could ride as well as her brother and keep accounts as well as her mother, and had opinions about everything from the sheep operation to the books on the parlor shelf. Samuel became what his early years had promised, a man of horses and a deep, unhurried calm that made animals trust him and people seek his company. And the Hawkins Creek horse operation, which he began to manage with Harvey's guidance by the time he was 12, became something people came from other parts of the county to see. Pearl had more gray at her temples by 1885, and she regarded it with the equanimity of a woman who has never found much to recommend vanity over living. Harvey had gray at his at the temple, and through the beard he had grown the winter of 1882, and kept because Pearl had told him simply that she liked it, which was the last discussion the beard required. They were in their mid-30s, both of them, and the prairie had marked them the way it marks everyone who takes it seriously, weathered and real and held in something deeper than youth. They still rode out together in the evenings. This had not changed in 13 years, and Pearl thought it would not change. The horse and the fence line and the light going down in the west, and the two of them moving through the great quiet of the prairie together. Sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were good. On an evening in September of 1885, they rode out past the sheep pasture and west into the open country beyond the fence, onto the rise where you could see the land going out forever. And the sunset was an extraordinary event that night, the kind the Kansas sky staged occasionally with the casual extravagance of something that does not need to try, deep burning orange over a sky that shaded through rose and lavender to the deep blue of the east, with the land below it in gold and shadow. They stopped on the rise the way they always did, and the horses stood with the contented patience of animals that have been here before and are comfortable with the ritual, and Pearl and Harvey sat in their saddles and looked at the sky. "Do you remember," Pearl said, "what you wrote in letter number 38? Harvey looked at her sideways. "About the prairie going so far you forget the world has edges." "You remember the letter number," Pearl said. "It was an important letter," Harvey said. Pearl smiled out at the sunset. "You wrote that the land went so far I would forget the world had edges," she said. "You were exactly right." "I was trying to tell you the truth," Harvey said. "I wanted you to know what you were coming to." "You did," Pearl said. "I came to exactly what you told me I was coming to." The sky was doing its extraordinary thing, burning itself out in colors that had no adequate names, and the prairie below it was going dark and golden alternately as the clouds moved, and the wind was a whisper in the grass. And somewhere down at the ranch their children were doing the evening things of their lives, James with the cattle and Catherine in the kitchen and Samuel with his horses, and the whole place was as alive in itself as it had ever been, more so. Built up over 13 years of intention and love and daily work. "Harvey," Pearl said. "Pearl," he answered, It was everything you promised, she said, every single word of it. He looked at her in the burning evening light, this woman who had come to him across distance and uncertainty, and kept coming every day since, who had made his house into a home and his land into a future, and his life into something so full he sometimes could not hold the measure of it. And he thought of all the letters and all the years and all the evenings on the porch and all the mornings before the sun and everything in between. The blizzards and the lambing and the children and the books and the garden and the kitchen and the rise above the creek and the cribbage board and her hands in his. I meant every single word, he said. Pearl reached out her hand across the space between the horses and Harvey took it, and they held on in the last light of the September evening on the Kansas prairie with the whole wide world going gold around them. And the ground was solid under their feet, and the world had no edges, and there was no part of it that was not exactly what had been promised and exactly what was true. The autumn harvest came and went with its good work, and the Hawkins Creek Ranch settled into the winter of 1885 with the deep-rooted contentment of a place that knows itself, warm against the cold and full of the life accumulated inside its limestone walls. Pearl put the last of the garden to bed, and Harvey brought the cattle in from the north pasture, and Tom Briggs and Harriet came for supper on a Sunday evening, and Ida Mercer, who was now past 70, but showed no sign of diminishing in energy or opinion, sat at the table with them all and ate her fill and argued about apple butter and held Samuel's hand when he sat next to her, because she had loved all three of the children since before they could remember not knowing her. After supper the children were settled, and Ida was in the spare room and Tom and Harriet had gone home across the dark ranch to their own house, and Pearl and Harvey sat in the parlor by the fire with their books, which was where they had always ended up, and the walls of the parlor held everything they had put in them over the years, the shelves full and the fire going, and the sound of the winter night outside moving around the solid house. Pearl looked up from her book and looked at Harvey reading across from her, the familiar angle of his face in the firelight, the gray at his temple, the book held in hands that had built fences and held cattle and built a bookshelf empty and waiting and lifted each of his children for the first time, and she felt the word again, the word that had started everything, the word that had been a promise and had been kept. Peaceful. Not the quiet of absence, not the peace of nothing happening, but the deep and living peace of a life full to the edges with the right things, with love and work and the honest faces of people you trust, with land that goes on past the ability of the eye to measure it, and a sky that is always larger than anything you put under it. With children growing up in the good shadow of what you built, and a man sitting across from you by a fire who has been the ground under your feet since the moment he took your hand in the dust of Abilene and said your name. Harvey looked up, the way he always did when she was looking at him, some private frequency between them that had never required explanation. "All right," he said. Pearl smiled at him, her husband, the cowboy who had written her 47 letters and promised her a peaceful life on the prairie and had meant every single word he said, and who had kept it, every word, every day, for 13 years and counting. "Perfect," Pearl said. And in the fire-warm parlor of Hawkins Creek in the winter of 1885, with the prairie holding the house in its enormous and faithful dark, and everything resolved, and at peace and loved and lasting, she meant every single word of it too.